The thing too with crawl spaces, that crawl spaces often get neglected. They don't get the same treatment as a basement. There isn't a drainage system like we often find in a basement. We don't find that in a crawl space, even with a modern built home. And so a lot of times if there's moisture issues or drainage issues on the outside, the crawl space suffers as a result of that. So it does help if the crawl space is open. It's not isolated or separated from the basements. And if there is any moisture issues in the crawl space, that moisture can, migrate and mix in with the ambient air of the basement as well too. Always be leery of a house with a crawl space that's isolated from the basement, or if the house, the foundation of the house is just a crawl space. And if you can't get into the crawl space or at least look inside the crawl space, chances are bad things are more likely to happen in that crawl space. We can't confirm or deny the situation, but make it a point if you can't get into a crawl space that you didn't get into the crawl space. Be that crystal clear about it. As I mentioned earlier, the two approaches to insulating crawl spaces is insulate the wall, creating a heated conditioned space, or insulate that floor above that crawl space and separate the space. Remember that the concept of the thermal cavity, the thermal envelope of the house. And we want to include the basement and the crawl space in that thermal barrier. When you separate, insulative, conditioned space, it's difficult to maintain the environment of the unconditioned space. So to go back to this diagram here, you see the insulation around the box that we call conditioned space. If we want, if there was if below this home there was a crawl space and we insulate the floor of the finished space above it, we're separating that crawl space. The ideal situation would be to extend insulation down that crawl space wall and include the crawl space in that insulative cavity. So if I were just to draw onto the slide, like pretend there's a crawl space below here, we would want that insulation extended down along the walls here. And we wouldn't want this insulation on the floor here. So we would include this crawl space as part of the conditioned space, if possible. But it's not always possible, depending on the style house. If it's an old farmhouse, a lot of times these crawl spaces are just really just pits. They're dug out dirt areas that don't make it really possible for good circulation of air, or just the amount of moisture that can accumulate down there is a lot, especially with a dirt floor. So we prefer heated crawl spaces if possible, because it makes the floor above more comfortable. It's easier to insulate. Less insulation is needed. There's no risk of freezing pipes or even conditions with the ductwork as well too. And so once again, making crawl spaces conditioned space is the way to go. Another thing too is with crawl spaces, the hope is that the floor is finished to some degree. An exposed dirt floor anywhere in that lower level of a basement or crawl space is going to be problems. And if anything, we should have some sort of plastic over the dirt to minimize the upward evaporation of moisture from the soil. A tremendous amount of moisture that comes up from the dirt into the house. And it can really wreak havoc, and it's going to cause mold issues down in the crawl space. That is the area of the house when we talk about moisture in unconditioned spaces. The moisture conditions in the crawl space is more problematic to the occupants of the house than the mold conditions in the attic space. The moisture conditions in the crawl spaces don't get the attention that the moisture conditions in the attic do, because, for whatever reason, when there's crawl space in a house, we really need to pay attention to the moisture situation in the crawl space, because it's the moisture situation that can generate that same mold in a crawl space, and that mold that generates in a crawl space can work its way up through the house. So it's not as abundantly seen, and the circumstances are not as dramatic as we find them in the attic, but we can still get that mold situation in the crawl space just as easily as we can in the attic, but it just doesn't happen to such a degree in the attic where it's so visible in the attic when that mold develops over time. But be definitely leery of unfinished floors in crawl spaces, and even unfinished floors in basements, because the amount of moisture that comes up from a dirt floor is enough to cause a problem in regards to moisture and humidity issues in the basement.